In a slightly bleak day, and at the start of Kate's talk, a bleak outlook, I started to look for the hope that we all seek when we have these awkward days. And in both Kate and Susan's talk, we had that moment of possibility which we always look for in the practices which we undertake. And I noted Susan's talk about, in craft we hook into the big social and political worlds that are larger than ourselves. And that's kind of where I would like to bring my discussion points to bear. Because in both of our talks, we've sort of charted the spaces, the processes and practices of hope, which we can generate through these acts of making, where we work with materials in our lives. And I was thinking about our position today through these talks. We sometimes can't fail to place our context when we're thinking through the new ideas that were being presented to us. And we many of us, I'm sure, in this room come into this room with environmental concerns, with concerns around social justice, with active projects which seek to transform the world. And our talks give us the ways in which we have done these things. And Kate kind of brings us to consider the reuse of clothing in our lives, perhaps as herself as an activist, but also as a way of enabling others to see the possibilities of change and changing the shape of the world and purposefully redesigning our lives for the future. And Susan talks about these spaces in capitalism which people can use and forge afresh their relationships to offer new possibilities in these political oppositions. So craft is something which is a possibility, which we all recognise, but I fear that we need to do more for this promise of craft to be revealed. And I think today, perhaps, this has been a kind of a moment of thinking about how we can jump from these projects to have that moment where we do forge things afresh. So, we've in this point of political turmoil, but our talks today have talked about the way in which we can mobilise practice and skill and conversation to do things differently in the world. And I was struck by this idea that Kate suggested of straying, that we need to stray. And I've been struck by the fact that we need to be discomforted at the moment, because the things which we have perhaps come to hold true are being driven by our friendships, our relationships with others, the self-referential conversations that we have. The self-referential conversations that we have as makers, people looking and thinking about our work, and perhaps we do need to stray from those and to disrupt those if we're going to have this promise of possibility. And both Kate and Susan's work reminds us that if we're going to go into the world, we can hold disruptive conversations. We can be in studios, we can be in 3 continents having conversations about possibilities, and we need to have those straying conversations to make change happen. So, big challenges in the room. Both Kate and Susan brought big challenges into the room. Post-capitalist fashion, post-capitalist economies, making the most of opportunities. But the nice thing about these 2 talks was that they offered us ways in which we could mobilise and use craft as a tool, as a way of starting productive conversations, as perhaps a familiar anchor point, which then mobilises something different. And I think sometimes when we enter into those discomforting, straying places, we do need a few anchors to help us have those conversations. And so craft, fashion, making is one of those common bonds, and perhaps that is where the promise of craft really helps us, is that it offers us a route through which we can go and disrupt and be productive in the world. I had a conversation coming up here from Exeter on the train. I don't usually talk to people on the train because, you know, I've got my insular little bubble. And I was looking at my neighbour's patchwork. She'd got this little tin and she undid it. It was just at Cheltenham Spa Station, and she started to do her patchwork, and her cotton was Democrat blue. And I thought, oh gosh, you know, I was reading my Facebook feeds thinking this is all a disaster. But she was there with her 2 pieces of patchwork, and we started a conversation. And I initiated it, and I asked her what she was making. And then we had a really lovely conversation. And it reminded me that if we're going to do this disruption and this straying, we're going to need to have conversations. And ideally, we're going to have conversations with people who do not come into our orbit, because we really need to have conversations with people who are very different than ourselves in order to understand this world afresh. And so whether you are exploring the fashion and thinking through new ways of being in the world, or new spaces through which entrepreneurs can create new livelihoods and new possibilities, finding out the ways in which people who are very different from yourselves can do those might seem to me to be the way forward here. So, craft gives us this possibility, and I feel very inspired to go and reuse and mend my partner's jumper, which I have been promising to do for months on end now. And it gives us this sort of possibility. It gives us a tool. It gives us a way of having conversations. And I think that sense of burden, perhaps, that we feel around tackling these big issues of climate change, of social inclusion, of hatred, of thinking through the how we get beyond objection that people feel about politics. Thinking about ways in which we can use familiar anchors to open up conversations is where I would love to leave my response to these talks, because craft does perhaps give us that tool through which we can start that conversation. Thank you.